students from the law faculty mostly, or across?
Yes, I don't recognize all of them.
Yeah.
But I assume most of them are students, some members of my team. I was also expecting a colleague from another university. I didn't see her yet, and along with her, two people from the Finanzmarktaufsicht, the financial
Regulator, yeah.
and they also reported auditors. I didn't see them yet. Also not the sponsor. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'll probably still move to the lectern. Welcome to the European Law Workshop, Europarechtliche Werkstattgespräche, which today will be held in English. I welcome you here at the Dachgeschoss of the Juridicum in Vienna. I welcome you online if you do follow us online. We are very honored and lucky to have today a very prominent speaker, His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Colin Scicluna. He will be speaking about the conference on the future of Europe, the state of play. Maybe inform us, I hope inform us, or we should at least have the opportunity to discuss with him what to expect in terms of delivery on the promises that were made in the context of the conference. So I very much look forward to that. Our speaker today currently is head of cabinet of the vice president, one of the vice presidents of the European Commission, responsible for democracy and demography. Dubravka Šuica, is that? Thank you, how you pronounce it. But he has a very long and prominent vita with a lot of assignments and stations throughout international affairs and international diplomacy, all ranging back to the early 1990s, where he joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Malta. So he's a Maltese national. But he has seen many postings after that. He has been already involved in the EU negotiations in the Secretariat of the Office of the Prime Minister of Malta in the run-up to the accession process. Later joined the policy unit of Javier Solana, who was at the time between 2006-2010 High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy. He has been ambassador of Malta to Austria and other countries, Hungary, Slovakia, and Kosovo, which is probably one of the reasons why we could convince you to come here. Certainly not the only reason, but maybe it was an incentive to visit Vienna again. He was also a permanent representative to the OSCE, which is also Vienna-based, as you know, from 2012. You see, I'm still 10 years back, so there's a lot more in his vita. He joined the office or the cabinet of the EU High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy, again in 2013, as advisor for the Middle East and North Africa. As of 2014, advisor on the southern neighborhood of the EU in the cabinet of Commissioner Hahn, who was then Commissioner for European Neighborhood Policy and Enlargement. And in 2017, the new High Representative for the Common and Foreign Security Policy, Federica Mogherini, appointed him Director and Deputy Managing Director for the Middle East, North Korea, and Gulf region in the European External Action Service. So there's a lot to read. There are a lot of points in your formation, in your professional career, which make us extremely grateful for you to be here. You have a broad range, a broad overview of the state of European politics, both the external as well as the internal dimensions, and we're very much looking forward to discussing with you. Just a final word on your background. You are by education, a lawyer, so a graduate of the University of Malta, but also of international politics at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And you also speak a number of languages, not sufficiently, however, German, which is why we're holding the talk in English tonight. Before we start, just a final word. We should be having, for those of you who join in person and not just online, we should be having in a short moment a buffet here, which is for after the discussions with our speaker, which is sponsored, and we're very grateful for that, by Cerha law firm. And also I thank my team, and especially Elisabeth Schweiger, who is now busy organizing the catering for the organization of the talk. And with that, thanks to the sponsor, thanks to my team, but also preemptive thanks already to the speaker. I would hand the floor to you, Ambassador Scicluna, for a brief overview of the topic, and then start the discussion on the state of play. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is working, right? Yeah. Thanks a lot for that introduction. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned the fact that I'm a graduate of law, because not only did I study law, but I've actually been here before, around 31 years ago. I was a member of the European Law Students Association, ELSA, and I attended a number of meetings and events here in Vienna at the time, some of which I remember, others I don't. Which means that the parties were very good as well. But with that's to show that the connection with Vienna, it goes back, with Austria goes back quite a long way. And indeed, it was not at all difficult to convince me to come back here, because it's always really a pleasure to come, especially at this time of year. Walking past the Rathaus on the way here and seeing the lovely markets is really a great pleasure. But this is not what I'm here to talk about. It's the conference on the future of Europe is a topic which is not easy to condense into a few minutes. But I'll try to do that, because I wouldn't want to talk for too long. I would prefer, in fact, to have a discussion. I'd like to hear your comments and your questions, your impressions of what this process has been about. But perhaps it's always good to go back to the very beginning and to look at why we launched this process, this conference on the future of Europe. And there were a number of reasons, some very political, some very necessary, including the fact that after the withdrawal of the United Kingdom, for example, we had a bit of an existential crisis in the European Union. We also saw that there was a rise in certain political discourses which challenged the European narrative. But then we also had, politics is also about realities and cynical moments as well sometimes. And one of the requests made of President Ursula von der Leyen when she was appointed President of the European Commission was to a commitment to organize a reflection on the future of Europe. She took up that challenge, and therefore this became one of the central planks of her mandate. However, it wasn't something that she was going to do by herself, because any discussion on the future of the European Union needs to be done among all institutions. And therefore, we had to have discussions with the Council, which represents the member states, and the European Parliament. And the three main institutions had rather different objectives with this process. I can't speak on behalf of the other institutions, but I can speculate as to what their objectives were. For many in the European Parliament, this was an opportunity to move to the next step in the institutional process, to look at the treaties on the European Union, to try to see whether more powers could be given to the European level, and by that to the European Parliament. And this was very much one of the objectives that they pushed. For most member states, they had a rather opposite view of what this should be about. they thought that we should, yes, discuss about what the future looks like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we change the structures that we have at our disposal. From the part of the European Commission, we saw this as an opportunity to engage directly with citizens. And in fact, from the very beginning, our objective was to make this not a discussion among political elites, but really to make this a deliberative process. And so we managed to put on the table a number of ideas, including the fact that we would predicate this process on a series of citizens panels. And that these citizens panels would be randomly selected citizens from all over Europe who would be given set topics to discuss in full freedom. There was a lot of skepticism about this idea at the beginning, because many people thought, well, first of all, we have parliamentarians to represent citizens, so why would you go directly to the citizens? Others would say the citizens, if they're randomly selected, are not experts on the topics that they're going to be discussing. So how can we have an educated debate on European issues among people who don't have the necessary background to do this? Nevertheless, we managed to convince that this was a good way of moving forward, because it was an opportunity for institutions to reach out directly to citizens. At the very beginning, we had a joint declaration which was made by the three presidents, the presidents of the three institutions, and essentially this laid out the kind of process that this was going to be and what the tools should be to achieve the objective. So we had the citizens panels. We also had a multilingual digital platform which was created specifically for the conference. And the idea here was that the debate would not only be restricted to the people who are participating in panels, but by having this online platform, literally anyone could access this platform, could participate in the debate, and could do so in their own language. So one of the big innovations that we had in this entire process was that everything was done in 24 languages simultaneously, which is a logistical nightmare and costs a lot to be able to deliver. But it was important that people should feel as comfortable as possible to be able to engage, and that it wouldn't only be restricted to those who, like us, speak a number of languages. And in fact, we had a number of participants who could only speak their own national language, because we made sure that among the people selected, you would have people who had minimum level, quite a minimal level of education as well. It wasn't only elites that we were after. It wasn't only people who have degrees. It wasn't only people who are in professional activities. You had a full spectrum of backgrounds, of socioeconomic situations, of people living in rural and in urban areas. And also, of course, apart from gender balance, also the full spectrum of age. And so we had the youngest who was 16 and the oldest who was 87 participating in these panels. But of course, the platform provided a space where even people who are not selected by that method could participate. And the ideas that came onto the platform and which were debated on the platform were then fed into the panels for the citizens to debate on in their deliberations. These citizens panels were divided. We had 4 panels which had different, I was going to say topics, but the topics were rather broad, because one of the challenges we had was initially we were trying to restrict the number of topics so to be able to have a more direct and a more channeled discussion. But then different interest groups started to lobby that their particular issue should be the one given preference and prioritized. So in the end, we had to literally put everything on the table. So we had one panel, for example, which was social affairs, youth, education, and digital. You know, that's pretty broad. You had another one which was about climate and health, that was not as broad, perhaps. We had one which was EU in the world and migration, for example. And another which was about values, democracy, justice, rights, etc. Each of these panels met 3 times, twice in person and once online. And as you can imagine, the fact that we were doing this in the middle of a pandemic created yet another problem, because first of all, it delayed the start of the conference. And when we did start, we had the first session in the summer, summer of 2021, so last year, when things were starting to open up quite a bit. But then the winter came, and we started having restrictions again. And we had selected for the third session, because we had the second one online, and the third session was held in 4 different locations around Europe, in Florence, Dublin, Warsaw, and Maastricht. And of course, you had different protocols in different places. So we had to postpone the ones, 2 of them, because when they were planned to take place, it wasn't possible for people to travel to those places. While initially we were planning to end the whole process in March of this year, in the end we had to finish in May, which gave us a little bit of breathing space. These panels came up with each one of them came up with a series of proposals and of recommendations. And then these recommendations were fed into something which is quite unique, because the panels were something that have existed before. We've seen a number of deliberative processes in Ireland, in Germany, I believe in Austria as well. You've had in some of the Länder, you've had deliberative processes that have followed more or less similar methodology. But this plenary was something which had never been tried before. And here we brought representatives of the citizens' panels, together with parliamentarians, ministers, commissioners, representatives of civil society, social partners, and elected officials from national parliaments and local and regional authorities. And while that sounds like a very good idea, the people who are participating in it didn't always understand what was going on. Because, for instance, we had parliamentarians who felt that okay, this was a format where they were coming together with other parliamentarians. These citizens would come along, report to them, and then leave, and they would get down to their usual business. And we had to explain to them that in this particular format, the citizens were equal to them, exactly. And that didn't go down very well with some of them. They felt that this was something that went against their prerogative as elected representatives. But over time, you could see that there was in a sense, a process of acceptance, that when they saw that there was a level of debate which was at a higher level than they expected, they interacted with these citizens, and in a way these citizens, from being just members of the general public, became in a way their own movement as well, because they coordinated their views together. They ended up defending each other's positions, even if earlier in the process they had not necessarily agreed with each other. And ultimately, out of this process, we came up with 49 set proposals, each of which had sub-proposals as well. So it's 49 proposals and 326 measures altogether. And these were presented to the presidents of the European Parliament, European Commission, and the president of the Council of the European Union on the 9th of May. So the entire process lasted 12 months from start to finish, 12 very intense months, because organizing all these different events, again, as I said, with the restrictions of the pandemic, was not straightforward. And quite a lot of controversy about you had some external, let's say, actors who wanted to find ways to influence the discussions that were taking place, especially among the citizens. And we had to find a way to, on the one hand, protect the space for this debate, but at the same time, allow people to observe it. Because one of the, for me, for example, this was something rather new until a couple of years ago. I had never encountered this kind of deliberative democracy. And it's really something that you have to see to be able to appreciate, because you see the kind of dynamic that develops within the group. For instance, one of the things that I found particularly impressive was that I think one of the successes of the process was due to the fact that people don't want to make fools of themselves. So even if they weren't experts on a particular subject, they made sure that they came prepared. They made sure they read up on the subjects that they had to deal with, and they wanted to make a good impression, and this had an impact on the quality of the outcome as well. So in fact, if you look at the proposals that came out of this process, there is not a single one that when you're reading it, you'd say, what were they thinking? There's nothing there that is completely unfeasible or unreasonable, or they're not asking us to set up colonies on planet Mars, or something outlandish. But the thing is that at the beginning of the process, we had people who were saying we shouldn't do this because God knows what they come up with. The reality is that many of the things they came up with are things that are perfectly feasible and reasonable. And this leads now to what we're doing next. Each institution has to look at the different proposals from its own perspective, because the competences are different, and there are certain things which the Commission, as having the right of initiative, is the one that needs to start the process, and then the Council and the Parliament, as co-legislators, will come into the process later on. And in fact, we started, the conference ended on the 9th of May, and in June, we adopted a communication, which was a roadmap of what we wanted to do next. And in that communication, there were a number of important factors already laid down. One of them was that the Commission work program for next year is going to be based on the outcomes of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And in fact, if you look at the work program that was adopted in October, there are 45 initiatives. Of those, 38 are responding to proposals from the conference. And this is the first time ever that you have a Commission work program that is based on an external exercise. Normally, our work program is something that is cooked up internally among the different directorates general. Without, there is consultation, but it's not the most, let's say, inclusive process. It's an internal affair within the Commission, with consultations with the Parliament, with member states, of course. But here, in a departure from usual practice, the basis was the outcome of the Conference on the Future of Europe. Another very important thing was that the Commission will embed this approach, this deliberate approach, in its policy making. And starting this week, on Friday, we will have the first ever European Citizens Panel, which will start to debate on, in this case, on food waste. And the outcomes of this deliberation will feed directly into an initiative that will be presented by the Commission next year. And this is a first. This has never happened anywhere in the world, because you've had deliberative processes and the outcomes have been examined by parliaments or by governments. But this is the first time that an executive body is actually saying, we're going to put this as part of the way we do business from now on. And so this is quite an important step. The third element as well was the importance of giving feedback, because the institutions have organized many events where they've listened to citizens, where they've given citizens the opportunity to say what they think and how they want to, how they would like the European Union to look like. But very often we've taken what we've heard and done something about it without necessarily saying too much publicly. This time we did it differently. We organized an event 10 days ago, where we brought together the 800 citizens who had participated in the citizens panels, got them together in Brussels, and the Parliament, the Commission, and the Council gave feedback on what each of them is doing with the various proposals. In our case, again, the Commission, for example, there are a number of these measures which we've already implemented since the 9th of May. In fact, the conference ended on the 9th. On the 11th of May, at the next meeting of the College of the Commissioners, we adopted an initiative called Better Internet for Kids, which is about safety of the internet, specifically for children. And there were a number of measures which already responded to some of the recommendations coming out of the conference. Since then, there must be 25, 30 other initiatives which have responded to these recommendations. Now, some of them were things we were planning to do already. But in a way, I guess that's a good thing, because that shows that our planning was in tune with the expectations of citizens. In others, there was ongoing work, and the input from the conference had an impact on what the actual outcome looked like. And in some cases, it added or it even tweaked the measures that were being proposed. So in reality, there is a lot already that has been implemented or we have planned to implement. The one area which is, let's say, more difficult to look at is that there are a number of proposals that require that we change the treaties. Now, the European Parliament has said that we should have a convention. A convention is it's a process whereby the institutions come together, look at the treaties, and discuss how the treaties need to be improved or could be improved. The Commission has said that, yes, now is a good time to do this. I think between ourselves and the Parliament, we would have different objectives as to what needs to be addressed, but we agree on the fact that we should have this discussion. Member states are divided, and you have some who would be open to having this debate, others who are rather hostile to it or against having this debate. Some of them because they think now is not the time, others because they think it never will be the time to do this. But inevitably, a discussion on this is ongoing. Obviously, the thing is that many, I would say about 10% of the proposals here are would require that we look at the treaties, because, for example, one of them is that there should no longer be unanimity voting on certain issues where it still remains. As you know, in the EU, there are a number of areas where you have qualified majority voting or majority voting, but there are some areas, including, for example, the common foreign and security policy, or most of it, where unanimity is required. And one of the proposals here is that we should no longer have that, because we now find ourselves in a situation, and this is very current, where one or two member states can hold the rest of the, can block the entire 27 member states from taking decisions on a given issue. One that is probably very actual, timely at the moment here in this country is there was a vote last week on whether or not to extend the Schengen area to Croatia, Romania, and Bulgaria. There was unanimity on the extension of Schengen to Croatia, but there was not unanimity on extending that space to Romania and Bulgaria. And Austria was one of the countries that, one of two countries that have been against this. The discussions will go on, but this is one example which shows how the requirement of unanimity is something which is very important for certain member states, understandably, but which, from the perspective of, let's say, of Brussels, can sometimes be a hindrance to being able to move forward on certain files. Yeah, I think I've already spoken for longer than I planned to, but it is very much in a nutshell. There's a lot more on every issue that I could say more, but perhaps if there are comments or if there are any questions from your side, I would be very, very happy to.
Yeah, maybe. Thank you very much for kicking off the topic and the discussion, and for giving us those insights. Maybe we should move on to a more interactive format and discussion. I have a lot of notes. Do you also have questions, or should I break the ice? Is anyone following the internet, by the way? If those of you who follow us on the internet, if you have questions, just put your comments into the chat, and we will read them out and pose the question. Is anyone following the internet? Yes, you are. Okay. Questions from the audience? If not, yes.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead. Yeah.
My name is I'm also a graduate of this university here, a lawyer, and currently working as the Deputy Director General of the regional government administration in the Burgenland. And I'm the former ambassador of Austria to the OECD, in Paris, not the OECD here in Vienna. Thank you very much, Excellency Colin, to have you here. It's really a pleasure. So we were in touch somehow. We still have to find out all our friends with Elsa, so you can imagine how old I am, as the same age as him. Thank you very much for giving us this insight. This insight into the process of the Future of Europe conference. Well, I was just counting when it comes to treaty amendments. So the last treaty amendment that you mentioned now, the convent, which is a proposal out of this endeavor here for the Future of Europe conference, was in 2009, the treaty of Lisbon. So that is, it was after December of 2009, it came into force, so that is 13 years ago. And when you count back from 2009, 15 years back, we had 4 treaty amendments. So we have quite a speed up of integration, because with every amendment, of course, we deliver competences to the European, to the supranational level. And there was leadership, there was commitment. I was also working at that time in 2000 and 1990s in the Federal Chancellery. There was enthusiasm to join the European Union. But that has been diminished, that has disappeared. And I wonder about the reasons. Perhaps you could also give us your insight. Where are the real problems of Europe? Why do we not integrate in that speed we did in the 2000 years? That would be my first question. The second question is, of course, you are the Chief of Staff of the Vice President for Democracy in the European Commission. You just mentioned what Austria did a few days ago, not following our historic tradition to support especially countries of Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, with arguments which are actually more national, even regional ones. Regional election is coming up, so there are rumors that this might have been the biggest concern about the electorate in January in Lower Austria. But on the other hand, of course, we have other issues. We have always issues in Poland with independence of the justice system, which is, of course, somehow a risk for democracy. We have continuous issues and debates with our neighboring country, our beloved Hungary. We know them very well out of the Hungarian Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you just decided in Brussels these days for the European Council coming up that the funding freeze will be there, but it will be limited. But still, the problems remain the same with the rule of law. And even in Germany, we have seen just a few days ago one of the biggest post-war counter-terrorist operations in Germany, when they load up a conspirators network which wants to overthrow the German government and to execute the Chancellor. So that are all signs for me which are risks for our democratic principle, for our democratic institutions on the national, but even more so, I think, on the European level. How would you comment that developments?
So before you answer, I need to apologize to the people on the internet because I forgot to hand you the microphone. I monopolized it, so I'm not sure whether your comment will be well understood. Could I hand it to someone?
Thank you. I think you raise some very pertinent questions which go very much to the heart of the kind of reflection we need to be having about the kind of future we want for Europe. Of course, in a sense, it has always been a debate between those who want more integration and those who want to limit it to certain spheres of cooperation. And in fact, some people thought that with the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, then that could lead to more integration, because they were traditionally perceived as being the ones that were kind of not, driving against further integration. On the other hand, the United Kingdom also had the best record in implementation of EU law and EU policy, by far. There are scoreboards of who would implement directives and the regulations best, and the UK was always way ahead of everybody else, ironically enough. I think there are cycles as well. So there are moments where integration is more pursued, is the order of the day, let's say. And I think that the time that you mentioned during the 90s, when I think there had been the enlargement of 1995, when Austria joined together with Sweden and Finland. At the same time, that was the beginning of the process which led to the enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, as well as to Malta and Cyprus. So there was a wave where everyone wanted to join. It seemed as if everyone wanted to join the European Union. I think it's not necessarily a coincidence that soon after that happened, we had a shift. Because first of all, the Union had to adjust to the fact of going from 15 to 28 at one point members, and now 27. And when you have, that is quite an adjustment to make, having double of the membership. And institutions that were designed for 6 member states. We still have an institutional setup, which essentially is the same one that was originally there at the very beginning. So that is inevitably going to be a little traumatic or difficult as a passage. But then I think also immediately after the Lisbon Treaty, in the time since then, we have had a series of major shocks. The economic and financial crisis. When we started to emerge from that, you had depending on whom you ask, it was either a refugee crisis or a migration crisis. I prefer to consider it a refugee crisis, because actually the vast majority of the people who were coming towards Europe were refugees, not simply economic migrants. But in any case, there was an influx of people that created a reaction in many member states. Then you had the Brexit referendum. Then you had the COVID pandemic. Now you have a war right on our doorstep. So in these 13 years, you have had a series of shocks, which have been quite significant. While on the one hand, it would seem that there is a push or a desire for less integration in some respects, I would argue that in practice, actually, we have had more integration and more than we realize. If we take during the past 2-3 years alone, we have had, I think, 3 instances where measures have been taken, steps have been taken at a European level that could not have been conceived of 3 years ago. The first was the joint procurement of vaccines for COVID. Had anybody mentioned something like that in 2019, that have been laughed at. The second was, in reaction also to the pandemic, Next Generation EU, which is that member states agreed for the first time ever that the European Commission could borrow on behalf of member states. Some people call this Europe's Hamilton moment. I don't know if you're familiar in the United States. In the United States, when Alexander Hamilton proposed that there would be a mutualization of debt and essentially the creation of the US Treasury, which was a determining moment in the creation of the United States of America. Now, I don't think that they're exactly the same thing, but it is significant that that Europe has had this moment where we have mutualized an approach to refinancing. And this is also linked to the point you made about the funds that are being frozen for Hungary, because this is also part of the recovery package. And the third is the package, the series of packages of sanctions against Russia since the invasion of Ukraine. Again, I think that the level, the kind of sanctions that we have been able to agree upon are unprecedented. We've had sanctions before at the European level, but never anything as broad, as deep, as vast as these sanctions. So it shows that when there is a necessity to act together, there isn't really hesitation. I would add a fourth one, actually, because with the negotiations with the United Kingdom, the UK clearly wanted to pick off different member states against each other. And that didn't work at all. It was clear that everyone was going to stick together, including some governments, which are not the most Euro-enthusiastic ones. But still, they felt that this was one where they had to stick together. So I think, yes, there are certain movements where we see a drift in certain directions. But in reality, there have also been many instances where we are doing much more together. On the point you made about democracy, I think I wouldn't want to over-dramatize, but I do think we have a crisis of democracy, and not just in Europe. I think globally there is a crisis of democracy, and part of the reason for that is that we do see more authoritarian types of government, including governments that use democracy to entrench their position or use democratic means to do that. But also, I think, because there is a degree of complacency. I think in Europe, especially, sometimes we feel very comfortable and cozy that we have democracy, we're fine. Nothing will change that. But the reality is that it can change, and in some cases, it is changing. And when you hear certain discourse, when you see that even in member states of the EU, that the space for debate is restricted, that is a problem. And it's not just a problem in that country, it's a problem for all of us, because that space should be a common space. One of the outcomes of the conference, one of the proposals from the conference, is to strengthen our democracy. And in fact, one of the initiatives we will have next year is a package which we call the Defense of Democracy package. Part of it will be to continue the work that we've been doing on disinformation and especially to try to counter covert and hostile foreign interference, especially in elections. I mean, it's clear this is something that has happened. Elections in Europe have been manipulated by external factors. It's not, it's a fact. This has happened. Also, we want to try to see whether there are ways at a European level, working together, we can strengthen our resilience to these attacks on democracy from within, which is about education, which is about communication, which is actually about also acknowledging that, we have a civic space at different levels. We all feel an attachment to the town we were born in or where we grew up or to the country that we come from. But even somebody like myself who has lived and worked in Brussels for a long time, if you ask me, what does it mean to be a European? I'd hesitate to answer. And I think we should work on that hesitation, and we need to try to help to find an answer to that. What does it mean to be a European? It doesn't mean that takes anything away from my being Maltese or you being Austrian, or the two are complementary, or need to be actually complementary. And I think that this is also a way of strengthening our bond with our democratic institutions. And one of the issues that we find, that we see, is that there are questions of trust between citizens and the institutions that are supposed to work on their behalf. Sometimes that's justified, fully justified. And I think you've been following what's happening in the news in Brussels with the scandals which are being reported in the European Parliament. But it's not the first time that we've heard about things like this. So it is justified that there could be an erosion of trust in institutions, but some of it is also down to misperceptions, and it's up to institutions to explain themselves better. One of the proposals that came out of the conference was that the EU institutions should change their names, and actually I think that's actually probably a good idea. And I happened to be in the workshop, in the room, when this debate developed, because it was not one of the issues on the table. They were talking about something to do with fiscal responsibility. And there was one Spanish guy who was looking through his papers and saying, the council, what's a council? What does a council do? I don't know what the council does. And that became a whole discussion about, do the names say what they actually mean? And the European Parliament, okay, we all know what parliaments are, so that's clear. But the Commission, Commission and the Council can be so many different things. So perhaps we do need to try to make institutions more accessible, more relatable, in a way that simplifies the interaction between the different institutions. But for that, of course, it's also about having a discussion about this, not only in Brussels and at a European level, because many of the issues that we're discussing, if you look at the proposals here, many of them are issues that have a very local resonance. European issues are local issues as well. So this debate about how to build this trust, how to build this resilience, needs to be held at all levels, at local, at regional, at national, at European level.
Thanks a lot. I see more questions back there. Could you please hand the microphone to Diane Fromage and the colleague next to her?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Diane Fromage, Professor of European Law at the University of Salzburg. And I have, some more critical comments on the conference on the future of Europe, but I have to start off by saying I've had the chance to be involved in one of the citizens panel as an expert. So it's just, a little bit to push you and not as a general criticism of the conference. Now, I think the first point you started off with was the question of the tensions between the institutions, which in the end, I think was very much mirrored in the way, the outcome of the presentation was presented, with the European Parliament having made its proposal a few days before we even had the official proposals, etc. So in a way, I just wonder, and again, being positive in general about the initiative, how much we are facing a risk there, and in particular in terms of the management of the expectations of those citizens that participated in those various panels. You had 800 people who sacrificed 3 days of their time at the very least, on 3 occasions, without knowing what was going to come out of it, and I would dare to say without knowing up to the present day what is going to come out of it. So against the background of the democratic crisis you were mentioning, and the need for the EU to be a little bit better at advertising what it's doing, in particular, Next Gen EU, etc. I just wonder if we're really going down the right road by having those representative processes that have now been included in the procedures of the Commission. And the second point I'd like to make in this respect is also, we've tried and involved the national parliaments. I would dare to say not with a great success with the Lisbon Treaty. And I just wonder, whether we shouldn't try to involve regions, citizens, etc., but also turn to national parliaments, because they are the ones that are to check on the representatives in the council. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, criticism is welcome. And no, because this is, first of all, while it was, I think, in many ways a wonderful process, and I'm very glad to have been a part of it. But of course, it was also a very messy process, and part of the reason for that was that, I think sometimes I say both the best thing and the worst thing about it was that the 3 institutions did it together, because that made it significant, very significant. For the first time ever, we did something like this together, but it also made it very, very difficult. There were many things that we would have preferred to have been done differently, but we had to compromise because other institutions want things different. So criticism is certainly welcome, and I think that we need to learn lessons from this kind of process. It's useless to just say we've done a good job and that's it. Absolutely not. We need to look at where things could have been done better, because it's the kind of thing we need to do again. Not exactly the same, but we need to use some of those lessons to be able to improve the way in which we function in a broader sense. I think the citizens themselves who participated, they came, this feedback event, we invited 800 people to come, 520 came, which is a massive number. We were expecting 200, 250 maximum to come, but over 500 actually came. So they had the opportunity to engage with representatives, with MEPs, with commissioners, with the Czech Minister for European Affairs representing the Council, and they could ask anything they liked. Of course, they had an opportunity to discuss among themselves as well, to prepare their questions, because it wouldn't have made much sense to just throw questions here and there. But there were very specific questions, very searching questions, and difficult questions for us, for the institutions to respond to. And we knew that was going to happen. Some people didn't want the event to happen because of that, but I think we felt we owed it to the process to have that kind of frank discussion, and not only to say what we're going to do, on one or two occasions, even to say what we're not going to do and why we're not going to do it, because that's also important. If we were to cost these proposals, we can't afford to do all of them at once. So you have to prioritize. We don't have the human resources to do everything at once. So you need to be able to explain that, and people understand it, and they're willing to accept that this is the case. But I think more broadly speaking, it's very difficult. I think one of the big disappointments that we had during this process was that it wasn't visible enough. Not enough people knew that it was happening, and I think from the point of view of the institutions, we invested quite a lot in trying to do that. Now, personally, I think we could have been much bolder in how we approach that. But institutions, public administrations, by nature are not very bold. As a civil servant all my life, I think I can say that. But the thing is also that when you're trying to communicate on EU issues in general, we suffer from one major drawback, which is that there is no such thing as a European media landscape. We have fragmented landscapes. I mean, even in some countries, you don't even have a real, in Belgium, the country I live in, you don't have a national media. You have at least two, if not more. So it's very difficult to convey a message, just make one statement, for example, and just wait for that to reach everyone. It simply isn't going to happen, because it needs to be tailored to very different, very distinct markets. And that makes it very complicated. And it means as well that we rely on national media, national multipliers to convey that message. And given the fact that some of the governments were not particularly enthusiastic about this process, also translated into this fact. There were some countries where we managed to be more visible than others. There were some, for example, which were not interested at all early in the process, but then once the citizens became more known, there were a couple of them who became mini celebrities in their own countries as well, and were invited to talk shows, and one or two of them will be candidates in the European elections in 24, because they were noticed by the political parties and recruited. So it depends a lot on the different characteristics and the different situation in different countries. I think I would certainly agree with you that we need to make sure that this kind of exercise has resonance at the different levels. The national parliamentarians were a very important part of that process. And again, there was a mixed record. Some of them were very engaged and very, very involved. Others fought to have a seat and never showed up. So, that's something that has to be addressed in the particular context. And I think it was also quite interesting to see that I think we had far more interest and far more engagement among local authorities and regional authorities than we did at the national level, including the parliamentarians. So you had certain, we had one of the representatives of a local authority coming from a really small town in France, but he's very active in the Committee of the Regions, but he was there every time, took the floor every time. And that's great, because it doesn't only have to be the big cities or the big regions that have that kind of exposure. But you are right that we need to do more to include and to involve representatives at the different levels. But it is also a two-way street. Because, for example, one of the things that the Treaty of Lisbon did was offer more opportunities to national parliamentarians to get involved. But I'm not sure that they've availed themselves enough of those possibilities. Or if they have, whether they've chosen the right subjects on which to do it. That's for them to look at, not for me, but I would suggest that maybe that's something to consider.
Right. We move on to the next question. Could you also just briefly say who you are, if you feel comfortable with that?
There's something that I'd like to understand, which is if you, and I very much agree, if you say that integration is actually happening in practice, we have seen a lot of this in the past couple of years here during the pandemic in particular. I was wondering how can we make it better, transparent in practice and reality, because they don't perceive this kind of integration. And I think the deliberative process that is underway or has been kicked off of your conference is a very useful tool, but we didn't feature it to future policy making as a constant feature, as a constant channel. We want to do more, I think that's also what I was asking myself, to find the right multipliers. What is the lesson learned? I think we want that the right issues, we need to find them and we have more success in some member states and less in others, but also at least kind of the takeaway that we also can integrate in our work, integrate also in our role as citizens.
Well, I think, first of all, in a sense, you answered your own question in part, because I would agree with you that the more we find ways to engage citizens, including with this kind of deliberative process, the more, I think there's also a sense that, especially with European affairs, but I think also in a different way at the national level, it's like, the governments and parliaments, they're so distant that, there's nothing a normal citizen could do to have an impact on that. And when you create this kind of environment where somebody selected at random can actually come in and have a discussion, possibly with a parliamentarian and with a minister, then you kind of break the taboos as well. And I think it's important to do that. From the point of view of the Commission, I think we are very serious about these deliberative processes being part of the policy making. We have 3 of them planned. One of them starts this week, and by the middle of next year, we will have held 3 of these panels on different initiatives that are up for adoption next year. So the first one is about food waste. The second one will be about learning mobility. So it's about education and freedom of movement and how skills can be improved by exploiting the possibilities available. And the third one will be about artificial intelligence and the metaverse. So quite a broad spectrum of topics. At the moment, we're discussing what will be the ones that will come after that. And there we have a bit of a challenge, because since there are European elections in 2024, at a certain point, we will have to stop with legislative initiatives, because there will be no parliament that can legislate. But the idea will be that we will put on the table issues which are not necessarily of a legislative nature, but where it would be important to have this kind of debate. Now, of course, we want to make sure that in these first few panels we get it right to make sure that this becomes really something that will remain into the future. At the same time, we're encouraging others to do the same, because I think this is something that national governments should be looking at, regional governments, everyone. There's no reason why it should only be done at the European level. It is something that can be translated into the national level. In fact, it's easier because in most cases you can do it in one language. We have to do it in 24, which, as I said at the beginning, is extremely complicated to ensure. So the deliberative method is one. On the one hand, helps the policymaking process, but it's also, by its very nature, a communication tool. Because those people, in the conference we had these 800 citizens, but those 800 have families, they have friends, they went back home and they were talking about this. So they themselves became multipliers, and yet people among them who, they knew that the European Union existed, but that's about it. And they discovered a whole new world in many ways. And they talked about, one of them who was at this feedback event was telling me, he said, it's crazy. Now, whenever my family or my friends meet, they're always asking me questions about Europe. And I don't know enough that I can answer everything, he said. But they expect me now to be the expert on European affairs. But that means that, with each one of those citizens, we're reaching a broader audience from the communication perspective. So the more of these deliberative exercises we have, the better. I think there was another part of your question which I've forgotten. So if I've left something out, do remind me.
It's clear to me. I was maybe just also to make it concrete. It becomes, I think, a constant feature. I get this point. But is it then that the constant feature also in the next commission debate that depends on question mark when we have plans for the next enactment, and also in which areas? It's very broad, I understand, but is it a suitable tool for across the board? Because me, to be honest, I think it depends very much on the topic.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that there are some which work better than others. But there is also a degree of, you need to test and you need to experiment to some extent, because it's still as a science, it's still something that is developing. So different people will tell you different things. Some believe that these sectors are better. Others will say that any topic is. Personally, I would tend to think that some are better than others. So you have to be a little careful how you choose them. But then what's also important is that we need to make sure that we devise the method that these proposals will then feed into the actual process. So it's not just coming up with a wish list. That wish list needs to actually be on the table of the pen holder who's going to draft the first text of the legislation. And those elements need to find their way into that text. Because, again, feedback is going to be a very important part of it. It's not just that they will give us their proposal. We have to go back at some point and tell them what we've done with their proposals. So the feedback element becomes extremely, in a way, it's a guarantee. You're giving a guarantee to the participants that at some point you're going to, give them the satisfaction as to the work that they have done.
Thank you very much, Birgit Daibler.
Thank you for your explanations, especially for the explanations about this citizenship. It's not the first time that you tries to engage in citizens directly. The European Commission has a long history, several times when you are asking citizens for their opinion on several projects, even for tweeting new procedures. There are procedures where they open the whole page and everybody could address the proposal. Can you compare this traditional instrument with this new instrument? Is there a difference in the outcome? Is the outcome better? Is it broader? Are there views expressed that normally remain silent? And if there's time for a second question, you have said that around 30 of these measures would need revision of activities. You have mentioned one example, the abolishment of unanimous vote. Can you elaborate a bit more about the other topics that would need treaty revision?
I'll start with this last first. For example, one of the things that many, in fact, I think all four of the panels, irrespective of the topic that they were discussing, asked for more education on Europe in the curriculum, and that's something we have no competence at the European level. But it's remarkable how people were saying, you know, how is it that we learn nothing about Europe in schools? But the thing is, there's been a long debate about whether or not to try to introduce some elements of European studies in the national curricula, but this is something that very few member states are open to. Because when you start doing that, you start talking about how to teach civic education, how to teach history, and you know, you start touching on some rather sensitive topics. So this is one other that comes to my mind at the moment. Another one is, so it's not just about external relations, there's external relations, there's also about enlargement, for example. In fact, that is one where the citizens as well made a caveat. They said, we should remove unanimity voting, perhaps enlargement is the exception. That this is you know, if you're going to vote on having new members of the EU, that is one where maybe we might need to keep it. There's also the question of the institutional, different institutional setup. So, what powers the Parliament would have in terms of the right of initiative, for example. At the moment, it's the Commission that has the right of initiative. There was one proposal which was not a very direct one, but where reading between the lines, you could interpret that this possibility would also be extended to the European Parliament. That, of course, would require a change to the treaty as well. So there are a number of others. I think what was different here and what will change, what is changing compared to other consultation processes in the past is, first of all, the depth of the discussion. Because before, very often you had things like citizens' dialogues, where you'd have a commissioner sitting with a bunch of people and listening to what the people are saying, and that's the end of it. Here, you actually had citizens who were put in an environment where they had expertise at their disposal, where they could read up, where they could find out more about the topics and really go into a degree of depth before they come up with their ideas. So it wasn't just throwing out the first idea that comes to your mind. There was a process of debate and of discussion. There was one particular instance, because we actually told, the panels were divided into subgroups. And we actually said, you don't have to agree on everything. You can even put forward recommendations which contradict one another. And then later in the process, we'll see about dealing with that contradiction. But there was one instance where the subgroup actually told us, we're not stopping for lunch. We'd like to continue discussing for an hour because we want to try to find a consensus. And they did. They continued discussing until they could agree on something which they could propose in common. So I think this shows that the quality of the discussion is of a different nature than we had in previous instances. I mentioned the plenary of the conference, which was a unique setting, because you didn't just have the panels making their recommendations, but these recommendations, by being debated in the plenary, were then transformed into proposals, which are very, when you look at the proposals, they do represent the original recommendations coming out of the panels, but they had been discussed with elected representatives, with ministers, with the commissioners, and were endorsed at the end by the entire plenary, which didn't mean that the Commission, for example, is saying, we agree with everything and we're now going to implement everything. No, but it meant that the Commission or the representatives of the Commission were saying, these are reasonable proposals to be making. And we think that this is something that can be taken forward. And again, then I would also mention the element of the feedback, because that is something that has always been missing. And the fact that we have taken the obligation of saying, we will come back to you at a certain point and tell you what we're doing with your work, changes the nature, because you're also offering a second opportunity to be challenged. Because you could well have people who say, what you're doing is not enough. And in fact, at this feedback event, there were some who on some of the proposals said, you're not doing enough. You need to do more. You need to really get behind these proposals. So I think there is quite a shift. And in a way, the institutions are putting themselves out of their comfort zone. I mean, I can tell you that even within my own institution, there were people who were skeptical about the entire process, because they thought, how can you have a process where you don't know the outcome? To which I used to respond, well, that's the whole point of the exercise. We don't know the outcome, because if we did, then why go through the whole hassle of doing it? But this is the kind of approach that is not uncommon in public administration.
Thank you very much. I see a question perhaps from the internet.
I hope it's not one of my colleagues firing me.
I think the microphone was off, but I hope you have still heard us on the internet. So we have a question from Professor Markus Frischhut from Management Center Innsbruck. And Professor Frischhut thanks Mr. Scicluna very much for his intriguing insight, and he asked him to tell us more about his assessment. How likely is it to move to a shared competence in the fields of health and education? And he also points out that there seems to have been an express legislative basis in the constitutional treaty, which would have already provided for combating serious cross-border health risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, there are a lot of things in the constitutional treaty which would have given us a rather different type of European Union. But as you know, the constitutional treaty was rejected in a number of referenda that were held in certain member states. And in a way, the Lisbon Treaty was the consolation prize. It was the parts of the constitutional treaty that could be agreed upon. And even then, some people thought that was already rather ambitious. But I think the climate at the time, as was mentioned, was perhaps more one that was more open to having a debate on certain issues. But I'm not sure that now the situation is one where this can be discussed. But on the two areas particularly mentioned, education, I think I already said a little bit. I think it's very difficult to imagine that there would be a major change at this stage. Maybe what we could try to do is to approach it in a different way and present it in a way that is not going to have an impact on existing curricula and maybe would be something that comes in addition to. But that would mean that somebody would have to develop a specific curriculum on European studies or European affairs, which would be common or uniform for the entire European Union. Some people might agree with that, others may not. But I think we need to perhaps look at this in a different way to what we have done so far. On health, I think we've actually already achieved much more than would have been imagined possible. Had we not had COVID, I think we would not even be talking about a health union. Today we have a number of initiatives in place which are steps towards having a health union. For example, we have created a European health data space, which is something in the process of being developed. But again, it's something which, had we not had the pandemic, I think would have been impossible to imagine that member states would agree to even have this kind of discussion. So I think that these are examples of what I mentioned before, that when you have situations of crisis or where you have a necessity, you don't need to change the treaty. If there's a political will to do things together, you can do things together with the current setup. Of course, as somebody working for the institutions and somebody who believes that further integration is generally better rather than worse, I would certainly welcome having more of these, having more of a discussion on these kinds of topics and looking at where we can try to deepen our cooperation. One linking it to the conference again. There was one young Italian who was very passionate about the development of a European health passport. And in fact, the work that we did on the European health data space is a step in the direction of creating a European health passport. And the reason he was so passionate about it was that a friend of his was on holiday in Denmark. He fell ill, went to hospital. He couldn't speak a word of Danish. The person who was treating him couldn't speak a word of Italian or any language that was common to the two of them. And unfortunately, this young man lost his life. So this young man lost his friend because of an inability to communicate in a health situation. And he was saying, if only the doctor in Denmark had access to a database where he could see that this friend suffered from certain allergies, suffered from a certain condition, whatever it was. And so he made sure that one of the proposals in the conference was that there would be this European health passport. We're still some distance from being able to have that, but the fact that we created this data space where certain health information can already be shared is a step in the right direction. So he was one of the people who was extremely pleased to see that his proposal was being carried out. And I think that the more we can talk about the benefits that people can have as a result of this kind of cooperation, the more people will realize that in a way, it's the same thing as how comfortable it is to have a single currency and traveling from one place to another. Most of you are too young to remember that we used to have different currencies in different pockets at one point. But now that's something that we've forgotten about. And the same kind of approach could be applied in different areas. And I think health is certainly one which is ripe for further development.
Thanks. Yeah, that's an optimistic note, but I don't want to close just yet on the optimistic note. Although this might be a good opportunity. If there are more questions, please do come up with them before. However, your question is noted. I'd like to jump in with a remark and three small questions of my own. The remark is on education. I think a federal schooling system might be an answer to that. So you don't probably need to alter competences or curricula, but just establish a federal leg of schooling, which of course EU schools, which of course need funding. Maybe that is a way forward, or a lesson to be learned from federal systems where you also have Länder and federal schooling branches. That's just a remark. My question is we're so lucky to have you because you have such a long insight from both on EU policy from both the EU perspective and the national perspective. So you're probably best placed to explain the schizophrenic situation that we're in, which is that treaty reform seems to be a no-go. Still, there is a lot of attention and focus on will there be treaty reform or will there not be, in spite of the fact that a lot in the report is probably to be achieved in secondary law or even soft law. So there is this discussion surrounding treaty reform, and Yet in the past years, and you've discussed that, we've seen integration leaps in so many areas which went under or largely under the radar of visibility. And so maybe you can make sense of this. And my first question to you is, do you think this no-go treaty reform attitude is particular to our current situation, or has treaty reform in the past ever been so salient, where member states ever so divided? My feeling is that usually there was a consensus, there should be a next treaty reform, we move forward. And this time, it's probably not so. So is this a special situation compared to other reforms in the past? First question. Second question. You mentioned the working program of the Commission, and that you would introduce or try to convert or create convergence between the working program of the Commission and or at least some of the demands that are in the report. Does this mean that we can expect more quantum leaps of integration like we have seen in the past? So is the attitude or will the Commission try to achieve some of the rather ambitious remarks via secondary law, avoiding treaty reform, which, as we have seen in the past, can still involve a lot of integration process and less of the hassle? So will we see that in the Commission working program? And the third question is just a question of knowledge. Those panels, the feedback citizen panels, I don't even know what precisely they're called. Could you explain to me, and probably also others in the audience, more about their method of working? So how and when and what exactly is their role, and is it rooted in any legal? So I'm not sure. The feedback panels. So there's the usual consultation, I assume, that will still be kept up in the form of green books. And now you said that the implementation of the report and the proposals that the Commission has come up with are carried back to the citizens and assessed there. Is that a misunderstanding?
Yeah.
So how exactly is that done? When in the process is it done? What is the feedback? What is the impact? How is it formalized? Just a question of knowledge. Could you talk a little more about the formalization of that process? Thanks.
Okay. I do think we are in a special situation as to whether or not to reform the treaties, because I think the mood in many parts of Europe is that we need to consolidate what we have. We need to look at how we can implement the treaties that we have at the moment, and that the only ones who will benefit from further treaty change is the kind of the ultra-federalist approach, and that there is still quite a lot that can be done to achieve integration without going down that path. And I think, yes, the Commission will continue to be, ambitious in the sense that it will seek to execute its mandate in the way that the treaty is permitted to execute its mandate, which includes trying to ensure that the Union can work in a better way. Yes, treaty change is not the only way to ensure that. I think every piece of legislation, that is, every directive, every regulation that is adopted serves to improve the way in which we work together. In many cases, we're also adopting rules and legislation which update existing rules. So, for example, if you look in both the climate, the Green Deal legislation, and you look at some of the digital legislation, not all of it is entirely new. Some of it is, for example, recently we adopted legislation which will now go to the Parliament and to the member states on emissions. We've had legislation on emissions for a very long time, but now we're updating that law. We're making it stronger. We're trying to find ways to plug some of the gaps that exist in legislation. So you could say that this is the Commission using secondary law to integrate further. But another way of looking at it is that we are simply carrying out our mandate to ensure that the competences that we have are carried out in the best way possible. On these next generation of citizens panels, the new citizens panels, what we are going to do is we will have panels of 150 people, again using the criteria that I mentioned before of background, gender, etc., age. They will be given a more specific topic to discuss, and they will discuss this topic very early in the process. So their input will go into the drafting of the proposal, and that will then be put to the usual consultations with stakeholders, with others, with the general public, on that particular initiative. And then once it is adopted by the Commission, it will go to the co-legislators in the usual way. So what we're doing here is that we're introducing an extra consultation leg very early in the process. We will also, at a certain point, probably at the point where we're going to present it for adoption in the Commission, but that's still to be determined, we will go back to the members of that panel to give them feedback on how we plan to present their proposals. Because we would like to take on board as much as possible of the outcome of that process, but it may not be possible to take on everything for the reasons I mentioned before about feasibility, about cost, about resources, etc. So the idea is to be inspired and to base as much as possible on those recommendations, and then to give the feedback. I'm not sure.
Did I understand you correctly that this is already underway with the foodstuffs?
It will start on Friday this week.
I see.
First one will start on Friday this week.
I see. And is there a legal basis, or where is that rooted in the?
It's part of the consultation. So there isn't. We have a legal basis that citizens should be. Article 10, I think, of the treaty, which says that citizens should be consulted and should be part of the process. It doesn't specify how that consultation should take place. And this will be one of the ways in which that consultation will take place.
I see. Thanks. Vesna.
The European Commission has also competence in the European state aid in the according of the Article 107 of the Treaty of the Primary European Law, Lisbon, and I would like to ask you, can you tell us something, your experience with state aid, for example?
I'm afraid state aid is a subject I know very little about.
Competition or damages?
I'm very sorry. No, I would not pretend to be an expert on state aid or on competition law.
Something social problem in the family. Or
maybe you can be more specific about that.
Kids, something.
You mean the reform options in what the area of family law?
Yes.
Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Well, family law is something that we have a competence on because the Vice President is also responsible for demography, and many of the demographic issues that we are dealing with have an impact on family law. However, many aspects of family law are still competence of member states. So, for example, one of the main demographic indicators that we have in Europe at the moment is that we have a declining birth rate. Now, the European Union cannot tell people how many children they should be having, and nor should any government, in fact, be doing that. But at the same time, any authority has the obligation to create a context, an environment in which people should have the possibility to choose what kind of family they have, and we can't we would not define what a family is. That is up to each individual member state to do that. But at the same time, there are many significant issues that are happening in Europe at the moment, including the fact that we have an aging population, and the fact that we have an aging population is not always a bad thing. A lot of people look at it as being something which means that we're going to have difficulties with affording pensions, with affording welfare and care and things like that. But it also means that people are living longer and healthier lives, which is also a good thing, and it's also in many cases thanks to, of course, not only it's not just Europe that makes people live longer, but for instance, food standards have improved because we have legislation at the European level on food standards. Air quality has improved because we have standards at the European level. So, so there is a way in which demographic considerations, including family considerations, are impacted by the work that's being done at the European level.
Well, one very last question, if you permit me.
Sorry, I am sorry that I couldn't reply on state aid, but I really have no experience in that. I'm very sorry.
Thank you very much for trying. Last round of questions. We've consumed a lot of your time. I will make the start. I see there is one more question from the audience. If there are more questions, now is your time. Otherwise, we'll close the floor. My question is in the Juncker paper. One of the options was a repatriation of competences. We always talk about expansion and more Europe. There was also the option to take some or move out of some of the EU competences. Can we expect that either if there is treaty reform or even if there is no treaty reform, will there be areas where we will see less Commission action? And so a de facto repatriation of competences via refraining from legislation? And probably if you could just also...
More comment than question. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for giving me again the attention. Well, first of all, I like this discussion, although we are a small group, but I think it's always necessary to discuss. And I just wanted to point out that when I was studying here, it was in the midst of the accession process, and European Union law was not obligatory, was not mandatory, although we knew that we will soon join the European Union. I don't know when the Faculty of Law made it mandatory in its study program, but I think after quite a while, after Austria acceded to the EU. What I have seen, and I wanted to come back to your point that national parliamentarians are very important in that debate and also as multipliers. I have worked on all levels, other jobs as well. I was in Brussels. I was at the federal level in the federal chancellery, working for the Austrian federal chancellor. I was working for the prime minister in the region. I'm now working in the administration. And what I can see is that we're politicians, but also civil servants closest to the citizens. It's in the municipalities. And you can see that also if you watch elections, people are most enthusiastic when it's about their municipalities. When it's about the regions, you have already put a lot of effort into it, into the campaigns to convince them, but in a small region like mine, everybody knows ministers and prime minister, etc. When it comes to the national, we can see a fragmentation also here in Austria. MPs as well as ministers have really quite a bit of an issue being close to citizens. And when it comes to Brussels, it's not about Europe, it's not about the European Union, it's about Brussels, And what I've seen also is that when Brussels Brussels is mentioned when there is something proposed which you don't like. Yeah, we call that. This comes from Brussels. Yeah. When there is something we like or we would like to use for our own political efforts, we don't even mention Brussels. Just recently, on the 6th of October, the EU adopted the regulation on this, it's called emergency, emergency regulation on energy prices, with the price cap on revenues in their markets of electricity producers. And I watched it carefully because I'm a member of the supervisory board of energy electricity producer. And in the media, when it was adopted, more or less not a lot of coverage. A few weeks later, there was a big press conference by our vice chancellor, and I think also the chancellor, and especially the vice chancellor, said, well, and now Austria will introduce this price cap, right? We will do that. And even the media always said the government is introducing that. And it was not covered that this is a EU initiative. So when it is nice, it's an Austrian, it's a national initiative. When it's not, when you're not so comfortable, it's Brussels, And there, I think we also have to work on. But coming back to the multipliers and to the citizens, yes, you're right. I think the MPs, the national members of parliament, is really important, but also our MPs. They are big ambassadors, and I think in Austria we have at least one, or perhaps two or three. But Ottmar Karas, I think he's the best ambassador for Europe, and he always speaks up when it's about European interests. And I can just applaud him that he is bringing this European spirit to Austria. But I think we need more. And you have this DG, and you are responsible for democracy. What we have is, of course, we have the EU ambassadors here. They have this mandate to communicate, Martin Selmayr travels around Austria of all regions. We are preparing programs for him to meet stakeholders, to meet citizens, to meet pupils, to meet school classes, students. But still, I think this is a good initiative. And we also have Europarechtliche. We have, I don't know for the other lender, but in Burgenland we have 1.5 people, who should all the time communicate about Europe. That's also good and important, but I think we need more. We need, as I realized it in Brussels, whenever I knocked at the door of the European Commission staff, there was an open door. They always had time, You never do that in national ministries, Or if you do it, well, there is hesitation. In Brussels, you have an open door. But please open your doors and come to our countries. Create a division with people who are really, who are marketers, doing marketing for Europe, and going out to the region, to the municipalities, to the schools, to the universities, desk officers, you call them, just normal EU officials. Of course, we are happy that you are here, but the chief of staff or the vice president's cabinet will not have the time to travel around. But create a division where you have desk officers for the 27 countries, and they have the only job to communicate about all the initiatives we have, to travel around together with the missions here in our country, and explain to the public what's going on in Europe. And of course, the same is true when you do this. I think we need it on different layers. We need this dialogue. We need this future Europe conference. But I also have more or less, I ask the people who are communicating or who are contributing there to go back to Austria. discuss it also here what they discussed in Brussels. So at different angles, I think we should work on. Definitely Europe Direct, for example, we should get more funding. Yeah, 1 or 2 people for one region is not enough. Yeah, we do additional funding from the government, but I think it's a different point if you have local staff who are not familiar, who are not EU officials, or you have EU officials coming from Brussels, speaking perhaps also other languages, and then coming down to villages, to universities, to organizations, to pensioners, whatever, and open the dialogue also on the bottom level.
Thank you very, very much. Any other question? Otherwise, I would close the floor and ask you for final words.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, because it's a pleasure to be able to have this opportunity to discuss all these issues. I'm sorry that I can't answer all the questions, but there are very vast issues as well that we are dealing with here. I'd like to make a couple of comments. First, in reaction to this last point, I think if we had unlimited resources, this would certainly be one of the things we have to really focus on more. But unfortunately, many of the cuts in budget tend to be in this area, which is very unfortunate, because it's one of the areas where we need to make our work more known and more relevant to people. But one of the initiatives that has just been launched between the Commission and the Committee of the Regions is something which is called Building Europe Through Local Councils. And the idea is that every local authority will have one representative who is responsible for EU affairs. So in the same way that you have the official, or the I don't know what you call them in Austria and in other places, and you call them the échevin or the alderman, who is responsible for social affairs, for example. You will have one who is responsible for European affairs. And in fact, it's quite remarkable that it's taken us so long to come up with this idea, because it makes a lot of sense that in every municipality you would have a focal point dealing with EU issues. And it's something which we will be looking to develop and to make more more present. Also, not only because we would be able to say more about Europe and explain more about Europe, but because we can make that link to local issues, which, as I said before, European issues are not are also local issues. They're not just issues that are discussed at a very high level and which don't have a resonance at the local level. The point that you made about the repatriation of competences. There is at least one member state that says that perhaps it would be a good idea to have a convention so that we could reduce powers for the European level. It's possible that if eventually there were to be a convention, if there were to be a debate, that this one or possibly other member states would want to also discuss that issue. I mean, it's certainly not what the European parliamentarians who are pushing for a convention want. It's certainly not what a convention tends to be intended for, because the idea of having this kind of debate is to look at where the next level of constitutional development would be. But of course, you can't exclude that would be the outcome. The view of the Commission will depend, of course, on what is put on the table. This is a very personal view. I can't imagine that the Commission would wish to reduce its role or to reduce its competences. I would find it very hard to imagine that kind of situation. But at the same time, the Commission's role is to execute, to be the executive body, is to carry out what its role is according to the treaties, and to propose legislation and to propose an evolution of the European project that is one that will find agreement among member states. We have no interest in putting on the table unreasonable proposals that member states can't agree with. So obviously, before any proposals are made, there is a degree of consultation, because one of the things that is frequently forgotten is that, yes, the Commission has the right of initiative, and it is an exclusive right of initiative, but that doesn't mean that the Commission can afford to be deaf and blind to what member states and what the European Parliament wants. One of the big initiatives next year will be on mental health. And that's something that both the Conference on the Future of Europe, but the European Parliament has been asking for a long, long time. And eventually, this is something that will be developed. This year, we adopted a strategy on care, on the care sector, care both for the elderly, care for children, the whole care industry. And this is something that originated from the European Parliament as well. So even though the Parliament doesn't have the right of initiative as such, but it has a role to play to encourage the Commission, to push the Commission to take certain initiatives. And the Commission listens, because it is also its role to listen to the other institutions. Thank you very, very much.
All right, Your Excellency, Ambassador Dr. Colin Scicluna, thank you for coming here, discussing with us. I hope you will also join us at the buffet for some wine and refreshments. Thank you all for coming here, also the audience on the internet, and thanks again to our sponsor of the buffet, Cerha, and to my team who made this possible, Elisabeth Schweiger, who is again out busy preparing something, but also to you, Julia Zöchling, for handling the microphone, and Johannes Lukan for dealing with the internet. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night. Thank you so much. Thanks. It was a pleasure and a very lively discussion. My question about the panels, first of all, that went under my radar. I understood this was going to happen, but also I thought that we would institutionalize something like that. More formalized, to remain transparent, more preferential to citizens, including by